Hi, welcome to the channel, and I've long wanted to make a few videos where I simply discuss my favorite films, which is to discuss some of my lifetime peak favorite pieces of art, things that have perforated my psyche in a deep way and held up signposts about what it means to actually live. And so today and for this series of 3 videos, I'm going to describe and invite you in to explore a number of all-time classic films, but through the lens of man's existential journey. So in order to do this, I'm going to borrow a model from the author David Brooks, who talks about the second mountain. So man's existential journey, in a nutshell, is that first of all, we grow up and we draw for ourselves or envision for ourselves a first mountain. And this is a life's struggle, a heroic journey, an attempt to become the person that we need to become to attain conventional success. And first mountain life purposes all revolve around achieving things or shaping ourselves into people that are destined to give us status, wealth, security, power, vanity, bragging rights, making us come off to the world as seeming lovable and good. So it's about inflating our ego desires and making us feel safe and protected somehow. And a lot of men, of course, spend their whole lives going about a kind of first mountain without questioning why their goal is their goal and what that is. But some of us wake up out of that. Usually there's a kind of crisis. The whole thing around midlife is that at some point we wake up and we start to realize that the underlying motivation and the nature of the mountain and the struggle that our whole life is based around is hollow, see-through, unimportant, meaningless, actually. And if you've gained your first glimmers of success, or if you've had a huge milestone of achievement, and then you realize that it didn't fundamentally make you feel happy, you might have dropped in to something like a swamp, or a desert, or a jungle, or a wasteland. And this is a period of time where we step off of that first mountain and question everything. Jesus, I fought all my life to do this, and it seems utterly meaningless. Therefore, is there such a thing called meaning? And what would it be for me to live a meaningful life? What are my values? Who am I? What is my true sense of calling? Because I spent the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years doing something that now to me seems really false and empty. And this is the existential quest, the search for meaning. And without good guidance through this, and often we don't get a lot of good guidance through this, we can get stuck here actually in a kind of nihilistic void. So the answer is to seek out a second mountain, or perhaps, let's say, the answer is to answer the deep questions of your swamp time in such a profound way that a second mountain appears. And so the second mountain in life is we rebuild, redesign a sense of vision, purpose, meaning, service, which is built upon a more transcendental motivation, i.e., you're not going about this for your status, your wealth, your personal gain, your sense of vanity and looking good to other people, or your sense of security. You're actually called to give something of yourself into the world that is genuinely for the benefit. You want to leave behind a legacy that is beyond you, beyond your own needs for security. So as we go through these different films, we will explore this existential journey. But I've got to say, as a caveat before we begin, it's unlikely that great art is ever going to depict this existential journey in such a cut and dry way. If it does, you're looking at really tightly scripted hero's journey based stuff, classic kind of adventure, like mythological or almost kind of comic book superhero movies at this point, where you watch it and you feel like you've seen a cliche. It's so cut and dry, it feels like a morality tale. It's not a piece of art that pierces into some deep emotional part of you and raises enormous questions. certainly some of the films we'll be talking about over these videos, got so deeply inside me. I was thinking about them for years before I was able to distill and understand the meaning that they were calling out. That's my definition of good art. So not a lot of these movies are going to be cut and dry, except for one. And we'll come to that in video number 3. There's one director who actually did this first mountain swampland, second mountain model in a film, and it works out artistically and inspiring and kind of perfect. But we'll be attacking our existential paths in a bit more of an oblique way. The other thing that I'll say before we dive in is that there will be some subtle spoilers here, because to get what I want to get across, I do have to spoil some aspects of plot, but none of the spoilers are going to be so severe that they're going to spoil the movie for you, right? I believe that the stories and the characters that we'll be exploring are so rich that you're going to still want to watch them, but also watch them with more richness, with this kind of framing in mind. Okay, so let's go. So good first mountain films are always a bit tragic, because these are films about the quest of a personal ego, and that for the film to be truthful, that ego somehow has to die. So a good example to start off with is something like American Psycho, where you see the Christian Bale character in the mirror every morning going through all of his personal procedures so he can present himself to the world as the perfected 1980s investment banking male. And the extents to which he goes to this are huge, until of course he goes out and he meets Paul Allen, who is a much more glimmering example of this 1980s American perfection, such that in Paul Allen's reflection, our Christian Bale character comes face to face with his self-loathing. And American Psycho, of course, is a classic commentary on the extent to which you try and make your outer shell perfect, the greater the possibility that your inner experience and your inner psyche will become psychotic. So another good first mountain story is, of course, Fight Club. Now you might say, wow, Fight Club, of course, is littered with rage and angst and violence against our first mountain society. It sees through the meaningless drivel and toil that men in this age are generally going through, and it says this is no way for our full nature, our virility, our masculine spirit to live out. We need to go and do something else. So I would say that Fight Club really is a conversation about the first mountain. It's not a genuine swampland, because if he went into Tyler Durden or the Edward Norton character, if they went off into the swamp, they would be asking genuine questions about their soul's desire and what a meaningful future would look like. And instead, they're more intent on tearing down a culture that reinforces and has no vision for men beyond first mountain conformity and compliance. And that's how you get the whole notion of chaos, dynamite, the soap factory, and so on. Now, one movie I really love on the topic of the first mountain and liberation from the first mountain is The Truman Show. And you've got this really fun play on words, Truman, true man. What does it mean to be a true man? Is everybody watching the show, watching this innocent, uncorrupted Truman who knows nothing about the real world, is that a true man? Or is the true man the one who actually perforates the edge of reality to transcend his existence and find something else? Is that the true man? So it's kind of funny. But you've got this entire world who is conspiring to keep Truman in his first mountain, and his first mountain is just to be this innocent man, really, who never travels, but is a good friend and a good husband and does all the appropriate things that a man should do. Absolute picture of conformity. And you see throughout this movie that Truman is slowly awakening, and you've got this beautiful ending where he fights against all the storms to the point of nearly dying. Those are the stakes that are in it. He almost dies before he discovers that he reaches the edge of his world and that actually there's a door he can go through to go out. Now, the beautiful thing about the Truman Show is that that's not actually a happy ending. We're left with a sense of happy ending because he transcended his world, he completed a heroic act, but he doesn't go into, yay, meaning second mountain land, everything's going to be good. He actually goes more into the wilderness and the swamp. So if you imagine what happens next after he discovers his whole reality has been a lie, what stands next in Truman's life? Probably many years of trying to put together what he's been through, right? He steps out of the cult or out of the very limited community in many ways. Wow, that's not going to be easy for him. And yet we're left with the sweetness of that ending because he has somehow become free. And then I'll quickly mention another couple of films which so beautifully illustrate the first mountain. First, if you saw it, there is one of the big films from last year, which is Babylon. And you've also got The Great Gatsby, both interestingly comments on the roaring 20s. But especially if you look at Babylon, you're looking at a whole group of different people who wanted to make it in Hollywood and be famous actors. And one by one, their ability to be that as the talkies, the spoken movies came into form, one by one, each of these actors and actresses who were big went through a bit of a meltdown. They had nothing that they could do after that at all. And one of the most epic scenes I think we've seen in cinema in recent years is where the Brad Pitt character actually goes and takes himself off to die. It's an epic cinematic moment where it's like, wow, my first mountain was to succeed and be the most famous actor in Hollywood, in America. And as soon as that possibility is taken away from me, I'm going to kill myself right away because I do not imagine anything greater than this. And I do not think I have the resolve actually to go through the interior desert and be without my kind of vanity and status supply that my first mountain success gave me. Really interesting. Have you felt that when your own sense of status and career has been threatened, that the fear of what might come next would be enough for you to take yourself off to finish things? Really interesting contemplation there. So the main films that I'll leave you with, and there are 3 more, that really typify this first mountain motivation and approach to life. The first one has got to be the Godfather Trilogy. So for some people, it's the greatest film of all time. Certainly some of the most beautiful scenes I ever saw in cinema was where Michael Corleone goes back to Italy. But essentially in The Godfather, you've got 2 concurrent stories happening. Now the story I identified with when I first saw this around the age of 18 or 19 is the ascent to power, which is, wow, Michael Corleone, he's kind of the yellow-bellied, simple guy in the group. He's not really respected by the gangsters, yet he's got this immunity because he's Vito Corleone's son, but he's not much violence or power is expected from this guy. And so he rises up through the ranks, through the different mafia factions estimations, until he becomes himself the all-powerful godfather and the most feared leader of the most feared clan of the mafia. And that's his ascent to power. And when I was 18 or 19 years old and yearning for a sense of victory in a first mountain way, I would look at stories like Michael Corleone's, or I'd look at things like Scarface and think, wow, you know, this is kind of what I want for myself, and I identified in that way. But of course in The Godfather, you've got this other storyline, which is the truer storyline, which is in Michael Corleone, you've got this descent into his karma, or descent into his conditioning and his lower impulses. So if you remember at the beginning, Michael and particularly his wife Kay, they wanted to have a life separate from the mafia. He was in the military, he wanted to go and do something else. He was going to be the only family member that was going to be clean and really live the true non-crime life and live the American dream. And so bit by bit over the course of the films, you see Michael descend slower and slower and then more quickly into the same kind of violence and karma that had engulfed his whole family for generations before him, right? So Michael becomes the godfather, and the films are necessarily tragic if you follow Godfather 1, 2, and particularly 3, they're necessarily tragic because you see this corruption of the moral character of Michael Corleone. And try as he might to go beyond the conditioning and the karma and all the entangled relations of his family, he fails to do so, and he's pulled into the mire. Just when he thought he was out, they pull me back in. It's the most epic line, talking really about his own psychology and his inability to escape his fate. Another movie that I would really recommend you watching, particularly if you have spiritual interests, is a curious film called Samsara by Indian director Pan Nalin. And so in Samsara, you've got the main character who, as a rite of passage, goes away for 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, and he goes into a cave meditation. So he's there for such a long period of time. His fingernails are all long, his hair is shaggy and grown out, but he's achieved a deep spiritual state. He's achieved nirvana as a young man, and he comes out of the cave and he starts moving into the world again with this incredible spiritual wisdom. And he slowly finds that he's absolutely unequipped to face the challenges of real life. And particularly, he's unequipped to deal with the challenges of women and sexual biological desire. And despite having claimed and won this wonderful initiation, he's gone to the top of the mountain, literally and figuratively. He's not in a position where he's got any mastery over real life. And then you see this kind of tragic discovery of him coming down out of his mountain. So we in the West, we have a picture of, you know, if my corporate career doesn't work out, or I hit 40 and I realize that my business is not based on my soul desires and I want to have an exit so that I can then live a more spiritual life, we might start projecting that nirvana or spiritual attainment is a good second mountain. And actually in this film, his spiritual attainment was the first mountain. That was who he was expected to be. And as he comes off that first mountain, he enters into his own wasteland and swamp. So really interesting to note that actually you can enter nirvana and be unequipped. Actually, you can just end up being an embodiment of immature, ill-equipped beliefs and capacity to deal with the world. That film is a beautiful meditation in and of itself, and can shine a great light on actually just the level of conformity and conditioning that surrounds the spiritual path for many people themselves. And thirdly, and finally for this video, we'll have a look at, along with The Godfather, I think, the other epic, well-known, great movie of all time, which talks about the tragedy of a man's life, and that's Citizen Kane, right? No greater example, Citizen Kane. He grows up, he's moved around, an orphan child, and hits his 20s and builds this most incredible newspaper, media empire. He becomes one of the most loved and also feared and hated men in America, divisive figure, but extreme in his power and his success and the amount of money he's made. And the first hour of that film, I think, is one of the most charming, brilliant, kind of feel-good stories of rags to riches man rises to the top. But he gets to the top of that first mountain, and bit by bit you see the wheels start to come off. He's ill-equipped to deal with some of the consequences of his success, and there are kind of unquestioned aspects about his real inner life and his sense of wholeness and completeness within. You start to discover that actually Cain was a man who grew up with a particular hole in the middle of his soul, and the bigger the runaway success of his first mountain, the bigger the chasm within. And ill-equipped to go out truly into the swampland and explore some of that inner chasm, he descends more and more into his crankiness, into his addictions, into his solitude, and ultimately you witness his demise. And of course, you've got one of the most famous images of all of cinema ever, which is the sleigh being thrown into the fire. The sleigh is Rosebud. Rosebud itself becomes cremated along with the rest of Cain's possessions, and Rosebud, of course, was the one moment of him playing in the snow, childlike innocence and purity that was taken away from him, his nature as an orphan child, and the happiness he once experienced taken away. And that was a wound that he never managed to address. And so the final piece of his life, the missing piece, is the wound telling the story of the energy. The wound, the missing innocence, provided the energy of his great ascent, his tremendous first mountain success, and the wound tells the story of the disastrous and tragic fall from the height of his first mountain. And the ultimate tragedy is, as he goes into the swampland, he does not have the resources to process some of this wound and integrate it, heal, and reconnect with the sheer meaning of being a joyful child once again. That's it for video 1. Come back, because in the next couple of days we'll go more into this swampland, and I'll talk more about the pitfalls and the potentials of actually being in the midst of the kind of wasteland in the middle of our lives as men, how that's depicted beautifully through cinema and the arts. And if you resonate a lot with this video and you see yourself as seeing through the first mountain and yourself having questions about what truly is a beautiful life, how can I avoid the tragedies that I've seen in cinema and I know that could befall me as well, and how can I move towards a life of meaning? Check out my program and my community below, the link for the Legacy program. And we are creating in real life a path and a tribe for men who want to ascend to the later heights of a meaningful, integrated, beautiful second mountain.